your perspective, I mean, we probably have a limited understanding in South Africa or on the African continent more broadly about Ukraine's story of how it's ended up here. And maybe you could share with us a little bit of that story from your perspective of how the Ukrainian people have ended up in the situation that they are now.
Thank you, Janet, and my greetings to all the participants. And first of all, let me thank Justice Michel for this human dimension. It's very moving and important for us. I see the following two reasons for the Russian President Vladimir Putin to start the war with Ukraine: the challenge of the Ukrainian democracy and the dream to re-establish the Russian Empire. The Soviet Union was a totalitarian state, and at the same time, the Russian Empire camouflaged under the communist flags. I can bear witness about that as a former prisoner of conscience, who as a young man spent 10 years of imprisonment, 1977-87, in the Soviet Gulag. My first crime was the activities on behalf of civic liberties and cultural human rights of Ukrainians. My second crime was the struggle for freedom and self-determination of the Ukrainian nation. Soviet dissidents were the last victims of the Soviet communist regime, but there were generations of other victims before us. For many Africans, the Soviet Union was a positive counterbalance to the colonialism of the West. However, for many nations within the Soviet Union, its history was the history of despotism and colonialism, mass killings, extrajudicial persecutions, mass artificial hunger, and many other crimes. None of these crimes have been taken to justice, and it was equal to leaving the seeds of the future crimes. Indeed, the present criminal regime in Russia is the fruit of these seeds, and sooner or later, this regime had to launch a new world conflict. The collapse of the Soviet Union in 1991 became for Putin the greatest geopolitical catastrophe of the 20th century. But for us, non-Russian enslaved nations, the long-awaited liberation. Soon after that, Ukraine and Russia went in different directions. Ukraine started its path of true democratic reforms and economic development, overcoming its communist trauma. But Russia chose to return it into its own totalitarian past. Putin proposed his authoritarian model as the only possible one for the Eastern Slavic nations. And thus, the model of Ukrainian democracy was becoming intolerable for him, and Putin decided to put an end to it. Putin had one more motive to do away with Ukraine. He objected publicly the national identity of Ukrainians and the subjectivity of our state. Revival of Russian Empire became his idea fixe, as the empire is impossible without Ukraine. Russian historical and religious legitimacy remains in Kyiv, the capital city of Ukraine. On the 24th of February of this year, Putin started the realization of both of these intentions, waging a full-scale criminal war upon Ukraine. I'm sure my colleagues tell you more about all the atrocities and war crimes committed by the Russian troops. The goal is to force Ukrainians to surrender. Is this visible from Pretoria, or saying metaphorically, from the hills of Kilimanjaro? As we may conclude from the position of many governments in Africa, they see the events in Ukraine partially from a different perspective. Why? The most important reason is the distorted mirrors of disinformation. Ukraine is suffering not only from conventional weapons, but also from a damaging information war. Just two examples. For months, Putin had been saying that the Russian forces gathering on Ukrainian borders were not for invasion. Now Russia is conducting a full-scale invasion of Ukraine by land, sea, and air. Putin labeled Ukrainian government as a Nazi regime that persecute Russian-speaking population. However, Ukraine is a country with a democratically elected president of Jewish heritage, whose first language was and still is Russian. So we are surrounded by Russian lies, lies, endless lies. By these lies, the Putin regime seeks to elude responsibility. However, the confusion caused by an inability to distinguish between truth and error was a great success of Putin's regime. Decisions by governments or civic institutions based on skillfully distorted information too often were wrong, because they were not based on the real situation. As a result, the world has for too long avoided taking sides in this Russian-Ukrainian conflict, believing that both sides are equally guilty. Let me illustrate this point with the two arguments. Russia blamed NATO for barking at Russia's door, and many Africans share this view. However, why Russia accepted so calmly the fact that Finland and Sweden have almost joined NATO now? Because NATO is just a pretext, a smokescreen. The true goal is Ukraine itself. According to Putin, it has to become a colony again. Many Africans suggest that it is Ukraine who takes responsibility for this war because of its will to join NATO. However, Ukraine was a neutral state for almost 3 decades. In 1994, it gave up from its nuclear weapons in exchange for the guarantees of its territorial integrity. And it was Russia who violated the Budapest Memorandum in the year 2014 and annexed Crimea and occupied some part of the Ukrainian territory. It was then when the majority of the Ukrainian population decided to seek a shelter in NATO. Do you really suggest that Ukrainians may be blamed for that? Do you really suggest that we Ukrainians are predestined to remain in the Russian colonial state where we are century by century deprived of freedom, human rights, and independence? I'm very saddened that so many African nations who suffered so much from the colonial enslavement turned the blind eye to the fact that the Russian attempts to reintegrate Ukraine into the Russian Empire have a clear colonial nature. It's impossible to avoid taking sides in this Russian-Ukrainian war any longer. As Bishop Desmond Tutu once said, if you are neutral in situations of justice, you have chosen the side of the oppressor. I'm sure hundreds of Africans from countries like South Africa, Nigeria, Kenya, Senegal, and Algeria who have taken arms with the Ukrainians to fight off Russian aggression understood the Tutu's words properly. We feel deep gratitude to them. And I appeal to all of you, please help Ukraine to defend itself. And by doing this, you will help to defend the just international order broken by Russia. Do not support aggressors who seize territory and subjugate other countries because other aggressors would feel encouraged. And this would have catastrophic consequences for the whole world. Putin's regime has crossed all possible red lines and now is openly mocking world diplomacy, threatening a nuclear strike. We are facing not just a competitive power, but something that is essentially evil. Because Putin has based its policy toward Ukraine on limitless lies, enormous hatred, and merciless violence. All these three are basic elements of evil. However, we cannot appease evil. We have to confront it. Evil never stops by itself. It has to be stopped. Another quote by Desmond Tutu is decisive. You can't improve something that is intrinsically evil. Thank you.